honored to be here with Scott Turow. He would start by reading a little bit from his book, which I'm holding, so I'll give it to you.
Yeah, Steph has the only copy, so. So this is I'm just going to read right from the start. The chapter is called Gone. The date is September 13th, 2023. Aaron has disappeared. It has happened before, and despite my recent hopes, it will probably happen again. Everybody realizes that, except his mother. Do you think he's okay? Asks B, pronounced like the letter B. 13 months ago, as a gift of sorts for my 75th birthday, B agreed to marry me, although she's been reluctant since then to set a date. Late last night, while we were sleeping, a hellacious storm blew in from the north. The concussive power of the thunder doubled as it ricocheted off Mirror Lake, on whose shore we live. After a boom like an artillery round rattled our windows, I felt B rise, and a few minutes later tumbled back into bed with a cheerless weight that let me know that Erin was not home. Up for the morning, she's just checked again, hope against hope, with the same result. Of course, I answer about Aaron, doing my best to look convincing. You know him. He's probably by himself, out in the woods. But how did he get there? Now that she asks, this is a troubling question. Since Aaron's felony conviction a year and a half ago, after he was arrested with enough cocaine and meth to mean real trouble, his driver's license has been suspended. More important, the terms of the strict probation he agreed to in order to get out of the Skagit County Jail after 4 months there require him to live in our house and stay in close touch with us. Aaron, we both know, could teach classes at the university level in how to get in your own way. And yet, this is the first time since he moved in that he has, quote unquote, gone dark, as he likes to put it, turning off his phone and voicemail, relieving himself of what he often finds the most onerous responsibility of civilization, the obligation to communicate.
So I've read all 3 of the Rusty Savage books in the last couple weeks, and I've been thinking a lot about him as a character because he's so subtle, I think, for a lead character in like a big blockbuster franchise. Like his damage is very interesting and minute, and it's never the first thing about him. And he is the voice behind all 3 of these books, and he's very protective of himself and is able to kind of hide himself away at various points that make him a very fascinating and sometimes unreliable narrator. He is often infuriating, and he's very complicated. And so I just wanted to talk to you about Rusty. Like, I'm just interested in where this guy came from. You know, I know that you worked on the first book for many years. And, you know, I also know that, you know, you've also been writing him for decades now.
Yep.
So can you talk about his origins first?
Sure.
And then I'd like to hear more about, I have more questions about Rusty, but.
Well, Steph and I got a chance to talk for a while backstage, and I first have to express my gratitude to her for doing this. She's got a lot of other things to do besides talking to me, so I appreciate it. I also spent a good part of the afternoon with her novel, Your House Will Pay, and you know, she's a terrific writer, and I'm honored that she's here on stage with me. And it's interesting because in our conversation, Steph talked about the origin of her own writing as being sort of this relationship with Raymond Chandler and California. And the origins of Presumed Innocent, to some extent, are similar and different. When I was an assistant U.S. attorney in Chicago, and I'd been a writing fellow and then a teacher at Stanford for 5 years. before I went to law school. And I went to law school basically because A, my life as a writer was troubled, and B, because I had discovered that I had this intense interest in the law, which far outran, frankly, my interest in, literary criticism of the high order that is taught in English departments. But one of the issues that had sort of hobbled my writing, and it really is not, I put the question in those days as like, what's the purpose of the novel, which is as if I was going to answer the question and then write that way. Whereas the truth is, what I was really asking is, what kind of writer is it in my nature to be? But by the time I left Stanford, I'd sort of flummoxed one of my professors by saying that I think a great novel should appeal to both an English professor and a bus driver. And he was a great modernist and a Gide expert, and he thought I was crazy. He didn't, he thought that, he held to an avant-garde view that, the poet's the antenna of the race, art leads culture. And I really didn't agree with that. So I'd gotten that far. I go to law school, I become a prosecutor. And I'd started working on, I promised myself I would write. I had written a short novel that actually somebody in New York was interested in. But while that book was in New York, I suddenly turned around. I was in a courtroom. By then I was a supervisor, so I was watching two younger lawyers do their stuff. And for whatever reason, I turned around and I looked at the gallery in the courtroom. And it just happened to be one of those days. Nothing else was going on in the courthouse. So there were lawyers who were between court calls. There were, the usual mix of elderly people who come to the courthouse for entertainment, and plenty of other people in between. But it was just the diversity of that audience that was suddenly striking to me. Old, young, all races, and I suddenly said, that's it. Here is the subject that I can write about that would be of interest to both the English professor and the bus driver. So I started Presumed Innocent, and I didn't want to set it in the environment that I was working in, federal prosecutor in Chicago, in large part because of a story I may tell, but the way I'd been sort of batted around the years when I published a nonfiction book about law school while I was still at Harvard. So I wanted to set it far away, and because I'd been kind of cuffed about the head, I had exited the Harvard Law School campus for my last semester and worked as an intern in the Suffolk County, that's the Boston DA's office. And much of the background of Presumed Innocent is drawn from events that were literally occurring in that office at that time, including this election. But my supervisor there was the first assistant district attorney, was a great lawyer named Tim O'Neill. And Tim, in addition to being a terrific trial lawyer, was also a poet. And he read his poems occasionally at a Cambridge bar called The Plough and the Stars. And I said, what if I write what is really going to be basically a mystery novel? But what if I write that in a voice that is not like the voice of Chandler and Hammett, the hard-boiled, voice that's still, central to much noir fiction? What if instead the narrator allows himself more literary flourishes and occasional poetic turns, and that was where Rusty came from. It's that concept that we'd have this guy doing what is a pretty brutal job, being a prosecutor in a big city, but with, a sensitive heart.
There's so much weight to him, and he's definitely this deeply flawed character. I was thinking, in recent years there has been a lot of talk about likable narrators and anti-heroes in fiction. I don't actually know what the conversation around anti-heroes was in the 80s. Is that where did Rusty fit when Presumed Innocent came out?
I think the anti-hero was pretty well established in American narrative by then. That being somebody other than the cowboy hero who was the perfect man. Well, you want to take Perry Mason as an example. He never lost a case, never turned a client down, never laid a finger on Della Street. He was an exemplar. Atticus Finch in To Kill a Mockingbird is another, again, flawless human being, even the best shot in the county. But by the 80s, that had begun to be recognized as sort of a motif of television, and there were plenty of anti-heroes in American fiction, and probably, fewer in the world of noir. But Rusty sort of evolved.
Yeah, I think one of the pleasures of reading this book is that he actually gets to be the hero in this book. There's something cleaner about him in Presumed Guilty. He is doing, it's not like he's perfect in this book either, and he's still the same complicated soul, but there's a real pleasure after seeing him getting beaten up for 2 novels, in seeing him actually, be really good at what he's doing and trying really hard and getting somewhere with people in a meaningful way. There's a vindication. It's like you're rooting for him kind of unequivocally for a lot of the book, which is new after the after the first 2. And so, it feels like as an author, you're gentler with Rusty in this novel, but I also am curious. This is a guy you've had a relationship with for decades. Mm-hmm. And you revisited him, and in a very, very harsh second novel where mm-hmm. he suffers a lot and he makes some terrible mistakes.
Right.
And so, can you talk about how your relationship with this protagonist has evolved over the years? And really, these books are pretty far apart.
Yeah.
And you find them in very different places.
Well, the books are far apart because I didn't want to pigeonhole myself mm-hmm. by writing a series. So, and I just wanted to, I'd had this dream of being a novelist since I was 10 years old, and I wanted to do sort of different kinds of things. So I refused to write the second Rusty Savage novel after Presumed Innocent came out. 20 years later, it seemed like a much safer thing to do. I'd established my career as a writer and as a novelist, and I could go back to him. And, it's sort of the same thing now. But, you ask a great question, which is, Rusty Savage is an important person in my life, even though he, of course, doesn't exist. And I was with my friend David Kelly today, and David, who, whenever we talk about writing, he says something that just really amazes me. And he said today, he said, we spend our lives as writers thinking about people who don't exist, and on the other hand, people we don't know, and in most cases never will know, meaning the audience. And I have to mention David and give him credit for that, because I thought it was just a really profound thing to say. But I feel beholden to Rusty. He's the man who changed my life. And I had left him at the end of Innocent, the second novel, as you put it. in a pretty broken state, whether he recognized that or not. And I always knew I was going back to him one more time, in part because I felt that he deserved another chance. Whether he was going to take it was going to be in his hands. And he makes some mistakes in this book. One could argue that the role that ends up central to the novel is something that only a fool would take on.
You talked about pigeonholing. All of your novels take place in Kendall County. Was that always the intention, or did Presumed Innocent just become such a big hit that you couldn't leave the county?
No, it was it was more I was sort of just blundering along. The Kendall County was created more or less by accident, because I thought I was writing about Boston to start. But I wrote Presumed Innocent during my 8 years as an assistant U.S. attorney. And I don't keep a diary, I don't keep a journal. So stuff that was happening around me in Chicago that had some kind of emotional resonance to me, I would end up pumping into the novel. And, I went out, a buddy of mine took me out for a sandwich in a famous stand on the south side of Chicago, and that found its way into Presumed Innocent. And it was that kind of thing. Well, so here I'm writing about Boston, and all of a sudden it's beginning to look more and more like Chicago. So I just gave it a name so that it could be a place of its own. By the time I finished Presumed Innocent, I felt that I wanted to write about Sandy Stern, Rusty's defense lawyer. And I always say that when a novel is going well, there's a character who kind of runs away with the book, in the sense that, she or he appears and grants themselves an importance that you did not anticipate when you started. And Stern had been that character. He didn't even make an appearance in the novel till like page 190, but in many ways he took over. And so I wanted to write more about him. Well, I couldn't move him somewhere else. He was a prominent figure in Kendall County at that point. And this, the way these books have evolved as this sort of tapestry of an urban setting, although this book is set in the ex-urban and rural areas north of Kendall County. I just love that. I mentioned I used to take the morning commuter train, and I was fascinated by the fact that I watched a couple get on the train one stop away from me for years. And they were both uncommonly handsome people, which is probably why they caught my eye. But, they looked like a professional couple, and I just kind of, I've made up all kinds of stories in my head about what their life was like. So fast forward 15 years, and all of a sudden, these people become friends. And so they've gone from the utter background to the foreground. And of course, they're frankly nothing like what I imagined they would be. But that process has just always been really striking to me in life. And, the way you see people and they seem interesting but inconsequential, all of a sudden they're like at the center of your life. I am married to a woman I met more than 30 years ago when I interviewed her for a job at the law firm, for which I recommended her and which she got. And I think we would both say that we were, to say the least, subsidiary characters in one another's lives until about 13 years ago when all of that changed, and all of a sudden this subsidiary character is now the most important person in my life. And that the way that happens is as much the subject of these novels as anything else.
Yeah. One of the things that really struck me about Innocent was how much I liked Tommy Molto.
Mm-hmm.
Who is just this despicable,
Correct.
like little shithead in Presumed Innocent, and he gets such a you just love him during Innocent. He has this backbone, and Rusty could never see all of him, and and I think that's a power of having all these characters too, is that you get to see the totality outside of what Rusty sees. I mean, I have found that to be very fascinating.
I mean, Tommy Molto was just. He's somebody who's changed for the better for a lot of different reasons. Yeah. And, if you ask me as somebody who's psychoanalytically inclined, that's because his mother died, and it became liberating for him because he could no longer be the doting son. And, he ends up getting married and becoming a father, and, he blossoms as a human being.
I feel like you're the god of Kendall County.
I am.
I actually think I think somebody's already written a biography of you, but if there's another one, that's a great title, the god of Kendall County. Well. That's a free one. But so you must think about all these characters, when you're just at the coffee shop, not doing much. Do you ever just think about, such and such person, what they're up to?
Well, I certainly thought about Rusty, what he's been up to since, he was half destroyed at the end of Innocent. And, he says at the end of Innocent that he's going to head north to this family cottage. And I just thought, well, what happens to him? What occurred? And yes, I think about these characters as if they are people I know. And, it's just, it's part of the ongoing novel in my head.
Do you ever have, I know that you leave Kendall County for Marinago and the Skagen region, but do you ever think about departing from this world altogether in a novel, or are you pretty happy with writing in this arena?
I think this goes back to what I was talking about my time at Stanford. I was pretty miserable because I knew I was groping for something, but I couldn't find it. And mere will was not enough to do it. And then the summer I finished Presumed Innocent, I took a summer away from the law and wrote, I rewrote Presumed Innocent, went through the whole thing from beginning to end for the first time. And that was a great experience for me because I suddenly felt like I had the air under my wings that I always wanted to have. And I have sometimes veered away from Kendall County. I've published a few short stories that are set elsewhere, but it just feels so whole to me, and it's mine. And I don't feel any inclination to leave.
Yeah, I don't think I would either, if I were you. I think a lot about, genre fiction, because I'm a genre writer, and we were talking backstage, I kind of backed into it. I hadn't initially thought I was going to be a crime writer because I wasn't that familiar with the genre, and obviously you were teaching at Stanford before you even went to law school. And I was curious about your relationship with the genre because obviously, I often feel defensive of crime fiction because I think that it's a genre that is sometimes looked down upon because things happen and it's plot heavy, and I do think that on the other hand, sometimes when you write crime fiction and you pay attention to character and prose, that doesn't get recognized in the same way. And reading these books, I mean, they're so well, obviously beautifully plotted, but the writing is intricate and it's dense and it's thoughtful and poetic. I mean, just getting ready for this, I opened to a random page and it was this insight about how power magnifies people's personality flaws, you know, and this prosecutor, you know, might have done okay if he was a small town, you know, if he stuck to his realm as a rural prosecutor, but like this is bringing out all his flaws, and it was just so insightful for like just the page that I opened up to, you know. And so, like, I wonder if you have any feelings about that, like the place of genre fiction in American literature. I mean, or if you just don't care. I mean, because I go back and forth, but.
Well, I mean, first of all, as to plot, plot was almost dead and buried in American fiction at the time that Presumed Innocent and Bonfire of the Vanities were published by the same publisher in the same year. And both very successful books. And it sort of woke a lot of people up to the fact that, oh, you know, people like to read stories, you know, something happens. You know, because the great god of American fiction when, you know, I was in high school and probably in college was Saul Bellow, and with whom I had a complicated and largely imaginary relationship. He'd been a high school classmate of my father's, which is something I didn't know till both of them were dead, or I didn't want to know consciously. But, you know, the plot, as I've said before, of any Bellow novel can be summarized as a guy wanders around and thinks. And I knew that for some reason, a lot of readers didn't find that very fulfilling. And I believe in plot. I believe that readers always want to know what happens next. That's what we're interested in when we tell one another stories, you know, by the water cooler or as we're watching the kids play. So what happened, you know? And so I was not ultimately apologetic about the fact that I like plot, and I think plot, when it's done correctly, is revelatory of character.
Oh, yes, yeah. I agree.
But when I wrote the first draft of Presumed Innocent, and actually wrote a draft of the end before I'd written the middle. And I did not say who committed the murder. And my defense was, well, that's what happens in court sometimes. You know, you don't know who did it. So it's just, you know, it's another way of being quote unquote realistic. And then I thought about it. I said, no. No. People, you know, the mystery novel depends on the idea that we are going to know why crime occurs, and not only who did it, but why they did it. Now, and yes, that's a convention, and that sometimes causes crime or mystery fiction to be looked down upon. But of course, you know, I smile at that because all fiction depends on an artifice that we can actually know what goes on inside of other human beings. That's what fiction depends on, that we can know other people's motives, that we can relate to their thoughts and record them. But, you know, the truth is, of course, we don't really know what goes on inside anybody else but ourselves. But, you know, narrative and fiction are the antidotes to that kind of inevitable loneliness if we can find ourselves that way. So, the fact of the matter is that people are interested in crime. They want to know about deviation. They also want to know, in most cases, that crime doesn't pay. And they want to know how crime gets detected and how we find the truth, which is, of course, a subject of great concern throughout our lives. So, I riled originally, when somebody hung on me, this title of legal thriller writer. And, I wanted to beat my chest and go, oh, screw you, I'm a novelist. I was a writing fellow at Stanford. And then I'm like, I've had a great ride. I've had a great career. And I sometimes kid around, but I know most American authors would be happy to trade for, my readership and my reviews.
Oh, yeah.
And it doesn't matter what they write. And, I've just been really lucky, but I don't feel like I have to apologize for that.
Yeah. I was thinking about what you were saying about the resolution of the books. This is something I always run across, writing, because I wrote 3 books in a series, is just this idea like, oh yeah, you do have to give all the answers, and that's a tension when you're trying to write something that has the texture of real life. It's like when you write enough books, the suspension of disbelief is that this is happening this many times to like a small category of people.
I understand exactly what you're talking about. I don't know if everybody out here will, but you're just shorthanding what's going on in Steph's novels.
But on the other hand, what you were saying about like this is actually the job of literature. I think it's more obvious when you do it in a way that depends on plot. But the job of fiction is to impose meaning on events that are largely meaningless. Like a lot of people just they're born, stuff happens, they die.
That's a Beckett novel.
You want, but we as artists try to kind of find meaning in that, and sometimes we put meaning where it isn't necessarily there. And I think that's some of the comfort of fiction too. I also think, and I know that people have questions, so we can move on to that. But I wanted to ask you about, because one of the things that I find interesting about the crime genre is how naturally it overlaps with politics. Mm-hmm. And how I almost find that it is hard to avoid politics when you're writing about a court case or a murder. It just so naturally touches on so many sensitive points in the culture. As a best-selling novelist who has readers, I assume, on all sides of the political lines, how do you navigate writing about politics in your books? I know that you have, and I know that you're not completely silent on politics either. That's why I'm asking. But I was curious about that. Like, what is your strategy for dealing with politics and fiction?
So when I spent these hours reading Your House Will Pay, Steph's book that won the LA Times prize, I thought, wow, this is just a brilliant book because, it's about, George Floyd. And then I thought, wait a minute, she wrote this book before there was any George Floyd. But anyway, it is about politics of a certain kind, certainly racial politics, but it doesn't bang you over the head about it. And that's what I thought was particularly brilliant about it. I don't know which studio head it was about whom the story is told, and it may well be apocryphal, that, it was the 1930s, and one of his writers, and of course writers wrote on contract to the studios in those days, and brought the script in. I'd like to imagine it had a kind of socialist message, but who knows. But whether it was Zanuck or Samuel Goldwyn, whoever the studio head was, he said to his writer, look, you want to send a message? Use Western Union. And I think that's right, and it's not because I don't think politics has no place in the novel, but it can be incredibly reductionistic. Mm-hmm. And the novel exists in the realm of ambiguity. That's why you read novels, because you don't really know what this person should do. You don't know how this situation is going to resolve itself. You don't really know even what's right or what's wrong. Excuse me. When you're reading about Rusty Savage in the throes of this affair, and you want to be judgmental, and yet you can understand that there's something deep in this guy that somehow he has not been able to express in any other part of his life. That's ambiguous. I can teach political lessons about it. And when Presumed Innocent was published, there was all kinds of feminist criticism of the book. And some of it made sense if you want to view it through that lens. But, I wasn't trying to send a message. I was just writing the book I wanted to write. Did it happen to reflect a different time in American life? Yes. Did it reflect the kind of threat that many men experienced with the entry of women into the workplace in a powerful role? That's what it tapped into. But I didn't feel the need to discuss that overtly. And I still don't. I occasionally in these books, it becomes clear in Presumed Guilty that, Rusty Savage is not going to vote for Donald Trump.
Well, there's also a prominent black character, and because of that, race becomes part of the universe of this trial.
Right, but it becomes part of this trial because it wouldn't be realistic to imagine that a young man of some African descent could be tried in a rural county in which 49 out of every 50 people are white without race being of consequence, both in the way the jury is going to think about him and the way the lawyer has to try the case. So I write a lot of opinion pieces. And anybody who wants to know what I think about Donald Trump doesn't have to go very far to find that out. But I don't think the novels are the place to express that. And I will say, even the one or two lines that get thrown away, like Sandy Stern says in the last trial, that because he's a former Republican, but he just resents the way Donald Trump dominates the news. Well, some people are so dedicated to that movement that they literally stop reading and write me hate mail. And it's like, okay, your life is apparently all about politics.
I have found that when people are invested in a story, they don't see the politics.
I hope they don't.
I think that's why, crime fiction in particular is a interesting way to explore a lot of sensitive topics without it actually leading to any flame wars.
I think your novel does a brilliant job of that. The one that I've partly read.
I have one last question, which is just I'm also curious if you have practiced in a courtroom since these books started coming out, but just more generally, what's your writing life now? It seems like you're somebody who has worked really, really hard at a lot of different things over many decades, and I'm just curious, now that you're in your 70s, are you slowing down at all? Do you I know you were talking about your golf game. Like,
Mhm.
like what? Like, I will say I was almost surprised when I read the first two Rusty Savage novels, and I read this one, and it was actually just as intricately written. Because if I were you, I'd just be so lazy and resting on my laurels. And so I'm just curious, like, has your writing process changed at all? Like, what does that look like for you now when you sit down to write a novel?
I mean, I only know one way to do this. So it is true that the time that I used to give to practicing law is now probably given to golf. And I probably was better off practicing law, and certainly in terms of fulfillment. But, you know, I discovered a process writing Presumed Innocent. I sort of wander around inside a book. I write stuff down. I get into it in all kinds of different ways. If I'm writing about characters who've appeared before, I have to read what I wrote about them, and that stimulates other writing. And I allowed myself to do that for about a year. Mm-hmm. And eventually, of course, the plot is coming into shape, and certainly the characters are really beginning to take form. And then I write from, beginning to end. How I do that, I get up in the morning, I drink my coffee, I read 3 or 4 different newspapers. Not all of them every day, but from a sampling of the same 4 newspapers, the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, Chicago Tribune. I read some part of those papers. And then I start to write. Usually I'm up by 7, which is when the sun comes up in Naples, Florida, most of the time. And I write from anywhere from 3 to 5 hours. I don't have the attention span to write continuously. I figure that I work 45 minutes out of every hour.
It's pretty good.
Yeah, I think it's pretty good. I mean, if writers are being honest. My friend Rick Russo says that every writer finds him or herself asking the same question. They find their head inside the refrigerator and they go, "Why am I here?" And the answer is because it's very often the furthest point in the house from their typewriter or their pad or their, computer.
Oh, that's how I feel all the time. Well, do people have questions? Want to open it up?
Lon Sobel, a former lawyer as well. I met you through your books 1L while I was in law school and loved Presumed Innocent. Read the book, saw the motion picture, and then saw the miniseries that was made not very long ago. And I sat there through the entire miniseries saying, "Oh, this is poorly done. That's not right. That's not right." And then, of course, it ended altogether different. How did you feel about the miniseries?
I loved it, to tell you the truth. And I will say that I learned a long time ago that when a film is being made based on one of your books, it is not going to change a single word of the book. And I try to judge it by its own terms. Is it successful? The audience, this mythical creature out there, the audience loved that limited series, and I did too. And if you ask me why, I'll say because it was so well done. There were beautiful performances by the actors. I thought the writing, for the most part, was really brilliant. Bruce Vinegar is here, was my agent at CAA, and was just talking about how brilliant David's, pilot script, the first script was. It was just an amazing piece of writing. And I also have to say that the limited series got to something that I don't think is as clear in the movie, which is that there's a very dark core to Rusty Savage. And there is a very dark core to his relationship with Carolyn Polhemus. Does he know that about himself? No. He's clueless. And I thought that the limited series did a better job of portraying that than Alan Pakula's wonderful movie did. So, but mostly it's just, I sit there and go, is this a good work of narrative art by its own terms? And when it is, I think that reflects well on the author who created the characters and the story to start with. So I liked it, and David and J.J. Abrams are going to take a crack at this book, and I look forward to seeing what they do. But I know it will not be I know that not everything in my world will be recreated, their way. It's now their canvas to write on.
Hi, I'd like to ask, how do you write? How do you get inside the mind of someone who is not like you?
Mm-hmm.
How do you write a woman? How do you write a gay person, assuming you're not gay, that sort of thing?
Well, I think that's a great question. And, I don't know how other writers do it. I think that to some extent, you're always writing about yourself in the sense that you know what you feel, you know how you react, you know how it feels to be humiliated or scorned or in love or crazy. And you can then use your knowledge of your own experience and sort of broadcast it to imagine what it's like to be in another person's skin. This is the deeply moral function of narrative, is to teach us what it is like to be somebody else. And that's why storytelling, in whatever form, will always be part of the human experience, because it is the bedrock of our moral education. And whether I successfully imagine somebody else's life or not is something that, you guys ultimately tell me. But I try real hard. And if I'm not convinced, then I can't for a second think you will be. But I do feel it's my moral obligation to do my best to imagine those other lives. The last book I wrote was Suspect. It was about a 33-year-old bisexual female. I'm not 33. I'm not bisexual, and I'm not female. But, I happened to be rereading the book on the plane out here in connection with a film project that's, being undertaken. And I felt pretty good about it. I thought that 33-year-old woman, deepens and comes off pretty well as the novel goes on. So I was convinced by her. So,
how do you feel about the proliferation of true crime documentaries? There seems to be a lot of that out there.
Mm-hmm.
Your writing is inspirational and motivational. So for people who work in that field, do you have any advice or do you have any wisdom that you could share to elevate that genre, since there's so much of it out there right now?
Well, I think it goes to prove the point of what I realized in that courtroom now more than 30 years ago, I'm getting close to 40, which is that this is a subject, since Cain slew Abel, people have been fascinated by crime. And the idea that these true crime shows capture such a large audience goes, as I said, it just goes to prove that point. A couple of years ago, I did the narrative framework around one of these shows for ABC about a young woman named Angie Dodge who was killed in Idaho Falls, and horrible miscarriage of justice when somebody was convicted of her murder who didn't happen to have murdered her. I don't judge that stuff. The Angie Dodge thing was remarkable because the police had allowed so much access to their internal deliberations and their actions as they frankly blundered their way through that case. And not all of these shows have the same on-the-scene accuracy. A lot of it's reconstructed, and sometimes that rings a little hollow. But I can often, as I'm channel surfing, come across a true crime show, and since I'm such a law nerd, if there's a courtroom scene, I'll sit there and watch it. I just want to see it. I want to see what happens. I want to see how the lawyers perform. I want to see the bad questions they ask, or the good ones, or the judges' rulings, and I find it of great interest. Thank you all.